In this session, we're going to be talking about how bad websites currently actually are, how many people we end up excluding when we don't consider accessibility from the get-go, and then we're going to be talking about my sort of 6 top tips of things you can change from today. And finally, like Andrea already mentioned, we'll end it all with a short Q&A if anyone has any very specific questions, and I'm happy to answer those as well. Which means, without further ado, the actual session itself. Where to start?
Do you want to do the poll first?
Oh yeah, go with the poll.
You want to do that? Okay, we have a little poll here. So if okay, hopefully everybody can see those questions on the screen. If you'd like to cast your votes, it's all anonymous. Then we can share the results. We're getting 1 or 2 answers coming through. Okay. Any more in there? Well, I think that might be everybody. Is that everybody? Yeah, okay. And polling and share the results. So there we go. And let me just take a quick picture of that. Can you see that, Carlos?
I can.
You can, that's great.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of people not knowing what the accessibility standards are, 2/3 of people, and lots of people not sure whether their website meets these standards. Okay, cool, great. Over to you.
Thank you. In February 2019, if you can think back to that, feels like so many years ago, even though it was only last year, a non-profit organization called WebAIM conducted a survey on what we considered the Majestic Million. Right now, the Majestic Million is effectively the most popular, most used websites across the world. So it'll be things like Google and Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, etc. You name it. Like these are commonly referred to as the Majestic Million. Now, WebAIM did a quite comprehensive analysis of those Majestic Millions, where they looked at accessibility and only accessibility to see what is the current state of the web. And their somewhat disappointing conclusion was that I think about 97% of them failed to meet the bare minimum when it came to accessibility, right? And when we're talking bare minimum, most of those things aren't particularly costly. They aren't particularly challenging things to actually do, especially if you consider that we're talking about large companies like Google and Facebook that shouldn't just have the budget, they should have an entire division dedicated to just doing accessibility. But they failed to meet the minimum accessibility, right? Then this year in February 2020, WebAIM did the same survey on the same websites to see, okay, what has happened in the last year? How has things changed? Have these websites gotten better? Have they gotten worse? You know, what has actually changed? Because especially when you start thinking about it, you'd almost assume they would have been getting better, because in the last couple of years, there's been a huge push towards accessibility. The UK government, for instance, enacted the global guidelines to be part of the legal framework. So if you're in the public sector, accessibility is a legal requirement, and one that's enforceable by fines, by various means if you don't meet, right? And most of these companies work on an international level. They are subject to those same legal requirements on some degree at least. Their conclusion, what what was then, a year ago, 97% of websites failing to meet the bare minimum, was now at 98. So it had gotten worse, which is very, very disappointing, especially for me. But that's the case. So that is where we start. Like, we start our journey looking at the actual state of the web, and most websites are barely accessible. There's the legal requirement, which is, we'll get to the details of this a little bit later, but if you think of that as sort of almost step 2, being the legal requirement, these websites fail to even get to step 1, right? And if you look at e-commerce specifically as well, for instance, of course, something that's become even more prevalent now that we are all dealing with very different circumstances, and online shopping has become more common. The first law of e-commerce is, if your user can't find the product, they can't buy the product. And it's then not unsurprising that almost 70% of online shops end up being abandoned carts. This is the average online standard. 70%, that's enormous, that's huge. And again, not unsurprising though. Tesco's, for instance, a few years back, did a major push to make their online shopping experience more accessible, right? And what they did was they invested about £35,000 into making it more accessible. Now, what they did fundamentally were 3 key things, and most of those we're going to mention a little bit later. But what's interesting for now is to understand that these key 3 things are fundamentally quite simple things. They're very, for lack of a better word, they're very basic, they're very base level. But their £35,000 investment increased their revenue to 13 million annually. They and their chief executive is on record as saying that it wasn't just improving an experience for people who fundamentally needed it from an accessibility point of view, but actually ended up inviting all of their customers more, because it made the entire experience better, whether then you had a permanent disability or not, right? And when we talk about people with permanent disabilities, the reality, by the way, is that we are talking about 1 in 7 people in the world. That's not a small number. That's 1 billion people. That's a 7th of the entire population who have some form of permanent disability. And right now, almost every website are excluding them on some level, whether that's excluding them just a little bit by making it a little bit difficult, or outright excluding them completely because actually they can't get to the product, they can't get to the contact details, they can't get to the information that they are looking for. Now, maybe you don't deal with the world, maybe you're more concerned with the UK as a country because you only operate locally, and that's fair enough, it's understandable. But then you have to think, in the UK, it's 1 in 5 have some form of sensory disability. Over 12 million people that are mostly just being excluded. No real reason, not really. They're there, much like a few years back. So my history to get into where I am today, aside from working with charities, aside from working with local councils and governments, I, before that, used to work in social care. So I used to work with people with permanent disabilities. And one of the people I worked with was a chap named Leo. He's a lovely guy. Now, he had cerebral palsy, which is it's a number of complex neurological motor sort of disabilities. It comes in various forms. It's usually considered as it's a group of things. But for him specifically, what it was that he was in a wheelchair. He couldn't speak to communicate, but he could. I mean, he was average intelligence as far as, you know, intelligences goes, and somewhat of a dubious area to be measuring people by. But nonetheless, he was a very chatty guy, actually, but he couldn't communicate verbally. So what he had was something called a bliss chart, which you can Google it if you like afterwards. But effectively what it is, it's a pictogram. So it's like a chart of different symbols, meaning different things. And then you can combine those symbols to change things into active verbs or past verbs and things like that. So with quite a surprisingly small number of symbols, you can still articulate yourself quite well. You can, in fact, communicate. And this is how he communicated. He had a laser pointer on his, like by his ear, and to point to the different symbols, because his neck was mostly the muscle he could coordinate better with more intention. Most of the rest of his body wouldn't necessarily obey his wishes as well. And he wanted to learn how to do Photoshop editing. He wanted to learn how to use the computer more. And this is where I came in, because this is where, as part of doing social care and things, I was there to mentor and tutor him to learn how to do Photoshop editing. And the way that he used the computer, because again, not being able to control his muscles as finely as we sometimes take for granted, he had a big red button strapped behind his wheelchair, so he could use his neck to select things, much like you would clicking a mouse. And he would flick his neck to select something. Now, the way assistive technology sometimes work, and in the case for Leo, the way that it worked was that he was given specialized software which would cycle through different options for him. So it would start by cycling through, oh, do you want the keyboard? Or do you want the mouse? You know, what do you want? Do you want the menus? And he would select the keyboard by clicking. And then he would cycle through every letter of the alphabet, one by one, pausing between to let him decide what letter he wanted. So it'd go A, pause, B, pause. And he would continue to do so throughout the entire alphabet. He wrote a book, by the way. Incredibly patient man. Most websites then, and still to this day, this is a surprisingly common problem, is you have to write www. before you get to a website. There's no reason for this. There's no technical reason, because you can redirect subdomains if you want to go into the technicalities of it. But many people don't think about that. They don't think that, oh, we should probably have something be the default. And if you don't have the default typed in, we should redirect it for you. Oh, and we should make the default the thing that's easier to write, the thing that requires less typing. Because in Leo's case, he had to wait for the whole alphabet to go through to get to www, just a single W, click it, and then wait again. And he did that 3 times. He had more patience than I will ever have. And that became a reminder that the web isn't just for me. It's not just for me who can actually use a mouse and click things, for now at least. I mean, carpal tunnel syndrome is probably going to become more of an issue, but nonetheless, I am incredibly able-bodied at the moment. And I should not take that for granted, because I might not always be. There will be a day when I'm not. But meanwhile, until I am, there are people who already are. And there are people like Leo who would happily browse websites, who would want to learn how to edit photographs in Photoshop, but is constantly held back by technology and poor decisions, meaning their harder for him than they need to be. And this brings us to the 6 top tips I have. And they're not just top tips. They're not my personal preferences. They are the results of that same WebAIM study, that same study where they looked at the majestic millions of websites and they looked at, okay, what's the most common problems then? And they found 6 of the most common problems. And when I say common, I mean the least common one, the one we're going to start with, number 6, still happened on 1/3 of all websites. So that's 33%. And it was up between the first survey and the second one. It was up by 5% percentage points, that's how you say it, which is a huge increase in it becoming worse. And that was as simple as not defining the language of the website you're in. Now, the way you do this, and you can check this, there are tools online as well, but it's that it's the HTML tag. So that's the main tag that contains the entire website, defines the language of that website. And for a lot of websites, that's usually English, right? But you have to define that. You have to say, oh, this website is in English. Because if you're dealing with multilingual content, for instance, you then end up defining the little things as well. So if you have a phrase in French, you can define that phrase and say, oh, but this is in French. And when you do that, assistive technology, like screen readers, know that, oh, cool, this is in this language, which means I will use this engine when I speak this out loud. Because if you don't do that, half the time you end up sounding like, right. So there was a show in Britain many, many, many years ago, I think. I don't know how many of you've seen this. I've only seen it because I kind of grew up with it on one of the channels in Finland, which is a bit strange in itself, but it was called Allo Allo or something like that. So it was a British French comedy about the Nazi occupation in France, I think. But what they did there is that all of the actors spoke in a very broken English, French accented thing. I think it was meant to be funny, and it was funny at times. But it's not as funny when all your websites sound like that to you, because whoever built the website neglected to implement the language, neglected to define it properly. And the really, really sort of sad bit about this is that it's so simple, because you usually only have to do this once, unless you're dealing with specific phrases in specific languages. You have to define those on a per phrase basis. Most of the time, that's not a problem we actually have. Most websites don't do that. They're mostly in one language, right? You do this once. It's a single little bit that goes into the HTML tag. It's the main thing that defines the scope of the whole website. And that's it, you're done. You have now solved one of the most common issues with accessibility. Which moves us on to the next one, number 5. Empty buttons. Now, when I say empty buttons, what do I mean? Well, a button is usually any element that lets you submit a form. It's like a search box, for instance. In fact, let's focus on a search one, because a search is something that a lot of websites do have and a lot of websites benefit from. And search as a function is a great thing. It allows your visitors to actually be like, well, I know what I want, so I'm going to type it in. Brilliant. Most of those have a habit of using a little magnifying glass as an icon, which doesn't have to be problematic, but often they don't include a text version. So there's only this icon, there's only this image. And if you have a visual impairment, or you're using assistive technology like a screen reader that reads it out loud to you, what you end up with is a meaningless button, because now it has no text, means the screen reader can't make out what it's supposed to be. So you get a field that's usually just a single field for the search, and then an icon, and that's great for people who can see that icon and can understand that, oh yes, search, cool, I get it. I get what's happening here because of the context around it. when you use screen readers, a lot of the times you don't have that context. That's not how screen readers work. It's not really how anything works, even if we look at how our brain understands information. The only difference is that when you're looking at something, you look at this, you look at that, and you're doing that rapidly. Your brain is processing that into a singular context. A screen reader, kind of like taking that same concept, but slowing it down a lot, because now you have something that needs to process a singular thing at a time, sequentially, and then read it out loud to the person using the screen reader. Now, most people who use screen readers use so at a very quick speech rate. Like if you've ever seen anyone, or heard anyone, actually, I should say, heard anyone use a screen reader, those who are used to using a screen reader will do so, and it speaks very quickly, because we look at things very quickly. It's the same thing. But often when we try to think of, oh, what's it like using a screen reader, we'll often do that. We'll get jarred and we'll slow it down and we'll like, oh, this is tedious. And it's like, well, it is. And it still is for them too. But as is with everything, the more you practice something, the better you get at it, right? Bit of a tangent. Going back to the button itself is the fifth most common problem, which is about 25% of all websites have this, is that they have buttons that you can interact with, and whether you're searching or subscribing to a newsletter, but it has no text in it. So the button is empty, whether that's with an icon or just empty outright, which happens as well. The solution to this is to write text in it, even if you hide that visually. Even better is not hiding it visually at all, just display it outright. And don't write submit. Submit is system speak. Well, what does that mean? Write what it's going to do. Describe the action the person is about to take. If they're searching, then type search. Search is better than submit. Right. Moving on, but staying on form fields is the fourth most common issue, which is empty fields. Now, when we say empty fields, think again back to this search input, this field with an icon. All form fields can have a label. Whether that's displayed or not, they have, and that label is there to give meaning to form fields. Like what it does is, in the case of a search, you can be like, well, actually search isn't the best example for this. Let's use a subscribe to a newsletter instead, because there you're expecting usually, at the very least, an email, right? You want an email address, you have a field, you can fill in the email address. Most of those don't have a label that says email address. And because they don't have a label, assistive technology doesn't know what that field is for, because it doesn't have the surrounding context, right? It only gets to a field and it just goes input field, edit, because you can edit this and it's an input field, and that's all you get. And that's it. You're now stuck. You don't even know what's being asked of you, so you can't give it your email address. You can't subscribe. So tip number 4 is make sure that all of your form fields have a label, and make sure that that label is explicit with what you're expecting, whether that's an email address or a name. Top tip number 3 is, and again, there's a theme here. Third most common issue is empty links. And when we say empty links, we're going to expand this into also meaningless links, because again, the way assistive technology works, the way a lot of screen readers work, is that you don't have the context of anything surrounding it. Because if you're using a screen reader, you can browse a website by its headings alone, or you can browse a website by the links alone, right? And if you stop to think about this for a second, you might start realizing why that can be challenging. Because now, imagine all of the links on your homepage. in a single list without anything else. All right, welcome to our homepage. This is our main navigation. It's about, contact us. Pretty standard, not too bad. And we've got the links to your articles. And suddenly all screen readers gets is a link, a list of links that says read more, read more, read more, read more. Doesn't really mean much, does it? And this is the problem when we think about links, and empty links being there's nothing in them at all, which happens more than it should. But even worse is links that don't actually have any meaningful text in them. So whether that says read more or click here or just more, they're all meaningless. Because without the context around them, you don't know where that link is going. You don't know what you're going to end up with. And instead, what you should be doing is asking yourself, what's the least amount of words that can convey the most amount of meaning? So like for a page with details of how to contact your company for services, it'd be contact us or get a quote instead of these are the ways you can contact us or click here to contact us. We needed click here at one point in time because we weren't really sure what we were supposed to do with these blue underlined things. Click here was probably useful then, but it hasn't really been useful since. And people don't always click. Clicking is a very mouse-specific action. If you don't have a mouse, if you're on a tablet or a smartphone nowadays, you're not really clicking anyway, so it's not as helpful as it could have been. Speaking of helpful, speaking of screen readers, this brings us to the second most prevalent and common issue online. And this is 68% of all of those majestic million websites have this problem, right? It's up by 2 percentage points since the previous survey. It's getting worse. And it is images that don't have an alternative text. Images that in effect just as well wouldn't need to be there at all, because for a lot of people they aren't. And we think it's easy to think that this is a problem that only affects a handful of people. But the reality is that 1 in 200 people worldwide are legally blind. That's 36 million people. That's more than the entire population of Peru. And people who are blind, they have no option, right? They rely on screen readers. They rely on an assistive technology reading things out loud. And when images don't have alternative texts describing the context of that image, it might as well not be there. They don't know it's there. They usually, if this is a fun experiment to try with screen reader technology, is finding those pretty much all of the websites and having them read out loud. Because they try their best. This is the way that it works. Is they do try anyway. The technology that people rely on tries to make sense of the website as best that it can. And when it hits an image that doesn't have an alternative text, it will go for the URL of the image instead, which in most cases ends up then just reading out a URL, which will be http://www.domain.com/ and it will read out the entire URL. That gets tiresome quickly. And it's not very useful. I still don't know what the image actually depicts, do I? That is people who are specifically blind. Which gets us to the most common issue on all of these websites, and in fact, the entirety of the web. An issue that doesn't just affect those 36 million, but has the potential to affect almost any one of us, if it hasn't already. And that is a lack of contrast, a low contrast. 85%, more actually than 85% of those tested websites all have this issue. And it's gonna get worse, not better, because science and technology are allowing us to all live longer. And that in itself, I mean, that's pretty great. Quality of life, let's improve it, yes. However, 1 in 6 people in the world have a vision impairment. That's people with mild and moderate to severe vision impairment, and those 36 million people who are blind. I have a vision impairment. If I take these off, I can't really see much, can't read anything for that matter. That counts as a vision impairment. Granted, it's one that's corrected, right? It's good. That's good for me, unlike in many countries in the continent of Africa, where you still end up having millions of people who have vision impairments, but it's uncorrected because of a big gap in economies, for starters, and availability, technical know-how. But those 1 in 6 people in the world who have some form of vision impairment gets us to 1.3 billion people. That is more than the entire population of India. And when you start thinking about simple things like the condition of presbyopia, which is an eye condition that many of us will face as we turn 40 and beyond 40 for a good couple of decades, it's most often recognized in struggling to read fine print. That's where most people realize that they have presbyopia, or they have a condition that's developing to become presbyopia. That only happens because we're aging, right? We are only temporarily able-bodied. We are only temporarily not disabled effectively, because most of us are going to age into that, where our vision isn't going to be as good as it once was, if it ever was. I got these when I was 12, I think, so most of my life has been spent having a vision impairment, but I'm for the most part, I'm fine. I am privileged, incredibly, and there are people who are a lot less privileged, who are being excluded, who are currently not able to read things online. They can't access information because that information has so poor contrast. And the solution to it is simple enough. I mean, whether you're designing a website yourself or commissioning an agency to do it, you simply go, well, look, we want people to read our content, so make sure the contrast is high enough. And when we say high enough, what we mean is that there are guidelines to test this against. It's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They are the guidelines that the UK government decided these are a legal requirement if you're in the public sector. But they are also there. Mind you, they get very technical, and that's an issue we as an industry need to address. But they are still there. They are available for you as a frame of reference for, oh, look, the text, it needs to have this high of a contrast set against, say, for instance, a white background text, black text on white background. And then it's a mathematical formula, and it calculates it for you and with tools online. And then you can be, oh yeah, this has enough contrast. It could be even better. You can make it even easier to read. But at least these are meeting those measured standards, those things it needs to just to be readable. Because all of these issues, all of these top 6 that we've now covered, can be tested. There are tools that can test this for you to tell you whether it is or isn't accessible, which is a good thing, because the reality then is that only about 30% of accessibility issues can be tested. 70% you can't even test using tools, not automated tools. If you want to test that, you need to work with real people with real disabilities, because they have the lived experience and the knowledge to actually test some of these things. You're never going to know otherwise. But at least 30% you can get with automated tools. All of these 6 you can get with automated tools. And you should, because one day it's going to be you. We are only temporarily abled or not disabled. We sometimes have temporary situations or situational, not situation, our circumstances change, right? You could be a parent holding a child in your arm. Now you only have one hand available. That's the same as having a broken arm as far as things are concerned. As far as that website or that product or that service you're trying to use, there's no difference between your situational disability and your temporary one. Because you can't use the product, you can't access it. It means that when we do accessible things, yes, there are people right now who rely on it, who have no other options. And maybe you do right now, but a year from now, you might not. So it benefits all 7.3 billion people on this planet. That's it.
Great. Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and I know that I will need to go through our Cambridge Network website and have a look at some of those tips and make sure that I'm sure we're not complying with some of those. Do we have any questions for Carlos? I'm sure there are a few things spring to mind. If you want to, you can unmute yourselves and shout it out. We're a small group here, or pop it on the chat and I can call it out to Carlos. Nothing coming up at the moment.
Hi, Carlos.
Great, hello.
Hi. That was great. That was fantastic. Thank you. Are you able to say which 3 Tesco's changed?
Excuse me?
You mentioned at the start that Tesco's had implemented 3 of the top 6. Are you able to say which ones they changed?
Absolutely. So their top 2 ones that they did is the contrast. They increased contrast and things. They removed unnecessary images and then made sure to write texts for the ones where they did use images and needed to use images, because understandably they were still dealing with commerce, and a lot of the times you do have product images, then you end up needing to describe those product images, basically. And the third one was, I'm trying to remember now. I think the third one was a little bit more like, yeah, they wrote the texts for links as well, because they also had a lot of links that were, I think their problem was more, again, with links saying read more or more this, rather than being empty. And of course, the official list of problems is that it's empty links. But as far as I'm concerned, empty links and meaningless links, there's a lot of crossover, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Great. Okay, we also have a question from Vanessa, I believe. Where can we check our website, Carlos? So what can we use to check through the website to see what needs changing?
That is a very good question. Like I said, there's only about 30% of all possible issues that you can even test for using automated tools. But it's a good start, right? It's better than nothing at all. Well, if you can have a tool that at least gets you some way along the way, then that's phenomenal. I mean, do that. There are a few different, there's one tool called Tenor. Let's see if I can find the link now quickly, and I can pop it in the channel. Because there's a few different kinds of tools as well, right? So the first question you really want to be asking yourself is, do you want to or can you use an online tool? Like, is that a limitation you have? Because there are some good ones out there, such as Tenon, and they do a pretty good job. Better tools are tools you tend to have on your machine. So you have to, there's an element of using tools which are a little bit more integrated with perhaps your workflow, right? Things like Google Lighthouse does a decent job at detecting automated issues. They provide a very comprehensive report in that it's very easily digestible, which is great, but it's not perhaps as detailed as it could be to help you fix the issues, which is sort of an unfortunate byproduct of them making it, the report's nice, but it doesn't give you anything. And like David is saying here, yeah, it's a starting point. It's absolutely phenomenal because it does cover other things as well. And I mean, let's put it this way. If you think that, oh, I can only detect 30% of problems and the automated tools is flagging things up, it's very likely you have more issues as well. But again, it's a good starting point, right?
Great. I've also wondered about, you mentioned about screen readers. Is there a standard one, a good one to use to test out on our websites, or?
Right. So there's two answers to that one, and I'm going to give you both because both are going to help you and everyone else. First thing is, yes, there's a few screen readers. There's JAWS and NVDA, for instance. Those are two more well-known screen readers.
Sorry, was that NVDA?
NVDA, I think.
VDA. Yeah.
But there's also simple things like VoiceOver on iPhones. It's built into it. Android devices also have built-in VoiceOver technology. I forget what Android calls theirs now. It might just be under like accessibility settings. These, especially iPhones, obviously being so popular amongst people, means VoiceOver on iPhone is quite common nowadays, more so than it would have been 10 years ago, where JAWS, for instance, was a lot more common. So there are things. Some of those tools are free, and there's no reason you couldn't have them and test with them. Others, like I think it's NVDA, is actually, no, it's JAWS. It's JAWS. I forget which one now. One of them is surprisingly expensive. Oh. Unfortunately. And you can test with these, and by all means do, but it's worth remembering that unless you are intending to use this tool as your now permanent new default, you're only going to be scratching at the surface of how it actually works. Because like I said, most people who use screen reader technology or assistive technology do so proficiently. They do so, you end up getting very good at them, obviously. You can't get anything done if you don't. So only using it sporadically a little bit, there's a risk that it won't be as useful as you would like it to be. In which case, having people with real disabilities is going to be incredibly more useful. And most people are very happy to be helping as well, because obviously it benefits them.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And also comment that useful to think of ourselves as only temporarily able-bodied, and I think that is something that we need to think of more. It's very, very true. Do we have any other questions for Carlos before we wrap up?